Here we also have online participants. We will be taking questions, obviously, when we engage both from our in-person audience and from those in online. My name is Alex Benkenstein. I head up the Climate and Natural Resources program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And I want to thank you for joining us today. This is part of a very exciting collaboration that we've developed with the French Development Agency, the AFD, and plays a part in SAIIA's engagement within the G20 process over this year, and indeed from last year. For those who might not know, SAIIA has a formal role as part of the Secretariat, along with two other organizations, of the Think 20, Think 20 being one of the official G20 engagement groups. And through that, we have brought together a wide diversity of experts from across the world, really, obviously primarily G20 countries, in the think tank and knowledge community. It's quite an open and inclusive grouping in terms of participation. And that structure has allowed for discussion, engagements, various forums, a number of policy briefings. Over 100 policy briefings were developed. Those were synthesized within the Think 20 structure of 5 task forces. That was then synthesized further into a T20 communique, and that was then fed into the G20 discussions, and we've engaged directly with JERCO and various other government ministries throughout the course of the year as part of this process. I mention all of this to contextualize the discussion we're having today. Of course, this is tied specifically to the G20 Social Summit, which I think we should also kind of pause and recognize the importance of having an opportunity like this, where really a very broad, diverse range of societal stakeholders are brought together to discuss the G20 issues. The G20 can seem a little bit removed from society, can seem maybe a little bit elitist, but the issues discussed in the G20 affect everyday lives. And that's certainly true for the topic that we're discussing today of a whole of society just transition. I am actually speaking on the second panel, so I don't want to be giving away all my gems right now in my introductory remarks. But what we will do to start off, I will hand over in a moment to Marie-Hélène Loison, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the French Development Agency. We're very pleased to have you here with us today. And then we'll have 2 panel sessions. I do think the discussion will blend together a little bit in terms of thematics, but the first dealing with the advocacy process session, and the second then recommendations for a whole of society just transition. I will leave it to the chairs of those, or moderators of those panels to introduce the speakers. What I would say is if there's a moment after the first panel, we will take engagement and questions, and before moving on to the second panel. But for those of you who've seen the program, the final section of our program is actually a slot for discussion. So if you feel that you're not getting your question in on the first panel, please bear in mind that we will have some discussion towards the end. We'll keep an eye on the time. Obviously, we started 20 minutes late, so we'll try and catch up as best we can. And in that spirit, I'm going to stop speaking and hand the mic over to Marie-Hélène Loison. You maybe just what you like.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for the introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues from SAIIA, dear friends, it's a great pleasure to be here. And in fact, I was Deputy CEO of AFD until 3 months ago. I am now Regional Director for Southern Africa, and it's my running joke to partners, it's the ultimate promotion for AFD. You're Deputy CEO, and then you get to go to South Africa. So very pleased to be here, and on behalf of the Agence Française de Développement, pleasure to welcome you to this side event dedicated to strengthening advocacy for a whole of society just transition. We are delighted to co-host this discussion with SAIIA at a moment when South Africa, as chair of the G20 Social Summit, is placing solidarity, equality, and sustainability at the heart of the global agenda. The topic we are addressing today is fully aligned with the core mandate of the AFD Group, supporting countries in building more resilient, low-carbon, and socially inclusive development pathways. For us, the just transition is not only a climate imperative, it is fundamentally a social contract. It requires placing people, especially the most vulnerable, at the center of public policies, ensuring that no community, no worker, and no territory is left behind as economies move toward decarbonization. Our experience in South Africa and globally shows that the energy transition cannot succeed without strong social acceptance, and that's something we witnessed in France as well, obviously. This requires investment in skills, social protection, quality jobs, and inclusive public dialogue, areas where AFD is committed to supporting partners, including institutions such as the PCC, SAIIA, and Paris. Today's side event comes at an important moment. The G20 Social Summit offers South Africa a unique opportunity to highlight African and global South priorities and to show that climate action and social justice must go hand in hand. Our discussions this morning, grounded in research, advocacy, and lived experience, will help shape concrete recommendations for the South African G20 presidency on strengthening social acceptance for the whole of society just transition. So thank you for being here in the room and online, and thank you to all our partners for the commitment you bring to this shared agenda. I look forward to the discussions ahead and to the practical recommendations that will emerge from this exchange. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Without any further ado, Slim, I'll invite you forward to introduce your panel. I would then also ask our panelists to step forward to just save us a bit of time. Kate, Lebogang, and Tracy.
Thanks, Alex. Great. So, good morning, everyone. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this session dedicated to one of the central ambitions of South African G20, advancing the whole of society just transition. And as mentioned by Alex and Marie-Hélène, linked to the G20 Social Summit commitments, our aim today is very clear: how to explore effective advocacy strategies for an inclusive just transition, and how to identify concrete pathways and recommendations that South Africa can bring to the G20 table. So I'm sure that we're going to have a very stimulating discussion this morning, and our discussion will also draw a lot from South Africa's own experience with an inclusive energy transition. And we do know from South African experience, one lesson is quite clear: the transition will not succeed without social acceptance. It was also nicely highlighted by Marie-Hélène, and it will not succeed unless we recognize the most vulnerable groups and without also put them at the center of public policy making. So I'm sure we're going to have a very stimulating discussion, and we'll hear from concrete example in South Africa, and I'm sure that those examples will help us understand what a just transition should look like in practice. So I'm very lucky because we have very fantastic panelists this morning. So thanks a lot for joining us this morning. So let me briefly introduce our speaker before we start. So we have Kate Philip. Good morning. So Kate Philip is a program lead on the Presidential Employment Stimulus in South Africa. Leborang Moulaezi, Executive Manager responsible for policy and research in the Presidential Climate Commission, and Tracy Ledger, leads the Just Transition Program at Paris Public Affairs Research Institute. So thanks a lot for, again, for joining us. So maybe let's start with a quick general question for each of you. So we do know that the need for an inclusive and just energy transition has been a central element of the South African G20 presidency. And I would like to know, from your perspective, what does it mean to advocate for a whole of society just transition in South Africa? And please keep your answer in 1-2 minutes, please. And maybe let's begin with you, Leborang.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Slim. You started with actually the hardest question, and you've given it to me first, which is a bit of a challenge, but I'm going to try my best to respond. I've always said in previous meetings, the just transition has different meanings depending on which sort of sector of society you represent. So different constituencies have a different understanding of what this means, but taking into consideration that, you know, we have a responsibility to ensure that this is a whole of society just transition. It's more complicated in practice, but really it's rooted in the shared understanding that the current transition that we're undergoing is not purely a shift in an energy system. It's a broader social compact. In fact, I like the fact that we started on that note. It's a broader social compact that asks really important questions. It asks who benefits, who bears the cost, and who has a voice in shaping the future. And usually these three groups are usually very different actors, and they don't come together in a way that yields the benefits that we want to get from this transition. So really, a whole of society approach is to take these three elements and put them together so that the impacts of our transition are not only fair, but they're distributive in nature, so we don't create a huge group of losers while a small group is benefiting. But it's also restorative in nature, so that we can restore dignity, we can restore opportunities to various groupings in our society that have been marginalized. So it's not a technical exercise, and I think this is usually the difficulty. It's not just a technical exercise, but rather how to ensure that there is equality and redistribution at its core. So the conversations that we've been having on the outside, that, you know, when people ask what has been the benefit of G20, and I mean, I'm also asking myself the question. I'm sorry to say that, but I'm also asking myself the question. But I think the fact that South Africa has really advocated the ideas around distribution and equity and equality have been really important as the key takeaway from this particular moment. And that's really at the heart of a whole of society advocacy program for a just transition.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Leborang. Like the fact that the whole of society imply different actors, and we need to, you know, to take them all together and to you know, design a concrete pathway that, you know, that will allow us to build a better society for everyone. Maybe Kate, what is from your perspective, what does it mean, whole of society just transition?
Well, actually, I think all the speakers so far have really hit the nail on the head. So, you know, I think the issue of the social compact is so important. The issue of a transition like this having social acceptance, and what does that mean? It speaks to social justice, which Marie-Hélène highlighted, and it speaks to the issue of equity and redistribution, which Lebo has highlighted. So just to add a little dimension on this, I think The critical challenge is that, in a sense, we have to look at what are the policies that then enable those outcomes. We know what the outcomes are that we want, but what are the policies that enable those outcomes? And we have to look both at the economic policies, but also at the social protection policies, and what mix of social protection policies. I'm coming from a particular angle in terms of the wider gambit of social protection policies, which I see as not binary choices, but complementary choices. But within that range of social protection policies, I think enabling access to work is a crucial part of an integrated approach. And one of the features of the transition is that labor markets are amongst the markets that are disrupted. And so what kinds of interventions does the society create to ensure that people have access to economic inclusion, and as part of that, access to work? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kate. Tracy, what does it mean for you?
So I think just to echo onto that, I think it's about making sure that the transition isn't just about technology and technological changes, but that it's fundamentally. But making sure that it's fundamentally about equity. And we found it useful in that respect to conceptualize a transition as comprising two different components. The one is, and the one that gets the most attention, is what you could call the transition journey. It's how you get from the current state of, let's say, the energy system to a decarbonized energy system, and what happens during that transition journey. That is making sure that people who are potential losers are taken care of. But the second thing to think about, and I genuinely don't think we spend enough time thinking about it, is the transition destination. What kind of economy and society are we hoping to have at the end of this journey? And there are a lot more ways in which inequality and poverty are generated, supported, facilitated by the energy system that go way beyond just the carbon intensity of the energy system or who works in the energy system. So if we simply have exactly the same kind of energy system, it just has a different emissions profile, then we haven't actually achieved a just transition.
Thank you so much. I really like the fact that, from your different perspectives, you've highlighted, specific points, and I really like the fact that actually it's also all about how to take into account the most vulnerable groups, but also how to tackle the triple social challenges in South Africa of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. So maybe, I would like to better to go a bit further, if you agree. So maybe I will start with you, Kate. And because you mentioned nicely that actually the social protection policies are key to precisely to enable and to push, let's say, the social agenda. So could you explain how public employment programs are a key policy tool contributing to the just transition, and how they can help strengthen the advocacy process for whole of society transition? Thank you.
So I fully agree with what other panelists have said in terms of a very wide framing of the challenge. But at a core part of the challenge is the jobs that will be lost. And that often the focus is on the direct jobs that are lost. But in fact, there are ripple effects throughout the economies that depend on the jobs in that are going to be affected by the transition. So a key focus of policy and alternative strategies has to focus on ensuring that those who lose jobs are supported to find alternatives. But it's not just about the people who directly lose jobs. It's also about the ripple effects in the wider community. We know that the wages that are earned, the supplier contracts, all of these things hold local economies together in many of these contexts. And so it's a whole local economy that is affected. Public employment can play two roles. It is possible to design public employment programs as a bridge for those who are directly losing the jobs, but then those jobs need to apply the skills of people who are losing their jobs in public interest contexts. There's basically, I challenge anyone to identify a skill that cannot be used in a public interest way. And so, it is possible to do this, but those kinds of jobs are different from what are often commonly understood as part of public employment. I think the key point is that the transition is never going to be seamless for those who are losing jobs, either spatially or in terms of what is immediately available to them. And so processes that look at alternative forms of employment and placement can be designed for those who are directly losing the jobs. But I think where public employment probably has a more obvious role is at the level of the wider community. And the ability to create meaningful work that serves the common good in those communities and creates a different mechanism to stimulate the local economy and to keep enterprise going and to keep incomes flowing in those economies while they recalibrate. So I would argue that designing those programs is a crucial part of a total package with many different interventions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate, for your point. And I think that we better understand, the need to design quite well these programs because it aims to target, the local community and the most vulnerable people. Let me turn to you, Tracy. So beyond the, let's say, the tremendous need to create jobs, which is quite obvious, I would like to know why is supporting energy affordability essential for achieving the just transition? And maybe another question related to the previous one, how can it help advocate for whole of society in South Africa? Thank you.
So the main way in which the majority of South Africans intersect with the energy sector is through access to electricity. And access to affordable and reliable electricity is fundamental to improving standards of living and creating livelihood opportunities. So the data shows quite clearly households that have got access to affordable, reliable electricity are much more likely to start their own small enterprises. Our own research shows quite clearly how especially women who don't have full-time jobs leverage those kinds of services to create additional livelihood opportunities. Access to electricity is positively correlated with household food security. Households can store food, they can cook. The cost of cooking is prohibitive often to people cooking at home. Cooking is the main requirement for electricity in low-income households. So there are all of these linkages between access to affordable electricity and the ability of people to have a certain standard of living and to engage in livelihood opportunities. So, people are saying, well, renewables are cheaper than coal in South Africa, and that's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that translates into more affordable electricity for users. And there are a lot of organizations like the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty that work on this assumption that if we make distribution more effective and we put more renewables in the mix, we will end up at a tariff that makes electricity affordable for households. The problem is that the empirical research that we've done has shown quite clearly that 40% of all South African households, about 7.5 million households, it's essentially all the households that live below the minimum wage, cannot afford to pay anything for electricity without compromising their basic calorie food intake. Now, you can be as efficient as you like in a market, you're never going to arrive at a zero tariff. So it means we have to think fundamentally about how we ensure universal access to sufficient electricity for people to improve their lives. And building on what Lebogang was saying about different solutions in different contexts, the fact that 40% of the population can't afford to pay anything for electricity is not a global north issue. So it's not something that automatically comes into policy.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for that point. Maybe Lebogang, so perhaps if you can build on what Tracy and Kate were just saying, and maybe given the PCC's key role in facilitating unjust and equitable transition, how do you see your role in pushing this agenda for whole of society transition? Thank you.
Tough question again.
Sorry. Yeah.
So maybe just to say that the role that the Presidential Climate Commission then plays is that after all of this interesting work done by the likes of Perry, done with the work that Tracy has been doing and the work that Kate does, and then the evidence and the empirical sort of like evidence that they have collected becomes a very useful sort of evidence base for the advocacy work that the Presidential Climate Commission then does. We're committed to fulfilling our mandate, which is related to, how do we plan for our transition to a low carbon economy in the way at a pace and a scale that the South African economy can manage. But how do we do this in such a way that we can also achieve our climate commitments? And we do this also balancing the lived realities of South Africans. So what Tracy would have mentioned around the issues related to the affordability of electricity. The assumption is that if the electricity is green, it is automatically affordable, and we know that that's not the case. There are issues there, and just by the mere architecture of our electricity system here in South Africa, it's just not reflective. The costs are not, we don't have cost reflective tariffs here in South Africa. So that compounds issues quite a bit. So a lot of the work, and when we listen to communities, they've been talking about just the expansion or just reimagining free basic electricity for poor and indigent households. Is it being made use of properly at the municipal level? Do we need to reimagine it? Do we need to drastically increase access to it? Because communities are accessing electricity whether they're paying for it or not. So it's in our best interest to make those services readily available to our people and ensure cross-subsidization continues to happen. One of our concerns is always the fact that if the middle class and the rich are sorting themselves out in terms of behind the meter with solar and backup storage, it means that the poor then have to rely on a fossil fuel-based electricity system that ends up being expensive, and there's nobody to cross-subsidize them. So those are like the thinking that goes with the work of the PCC. And then the work that Kate has been doing around what's the role of public employment programs. We know that coal in our country and coal production in our country is very regionally bound to one or so particular regions. And when you take away that activity, you've really devastated a whole community. So it's not just the 80,000 directly employed people that are working directly in coal, the coal value chain, but it's also the people that are in allied services, and it's also the people that they directly support. So in a broader social security program, what role can public employment programs play in that sphere? But we're doing all of this, but also realizing that we have a huge opportunity here around the interesting transformation that we can bring about into our economy. You don't just tinker with the electricity system or your energy system and think that you'll have your industrial system remain just the same. It also must adapt to whatever changes you're doing to your electricity mix. So how do we balance all of these things and ensure that all players are playing together in order to achieve this whole of society just transition that we seek? So that's the role of the PCC, to bring everybody together, play that bridge, balance evidence, lived realities, while we are still seeking to achieve that ideal end state where we have a greener grid, affordable electricity, and we have people in employment. Because it's not worth doing the transition if we negatively affect people and we devastate communities.
Yeah, very interesting, Lebo. And actually, your last, answer echoes quite well with your first one, because actually you highlighted quite nicely the fact that there are different actors on the ground, and whole of society transition is not about only taking into account the workers exposed, involved in the coal value chain, but it's more broader than that. So thanks a lot for highlighting that. Perhaps another question for you, Kate. So I think we've understood quite well the key role of public employment program, relevant social protection mechanism, and I would like to know. So we do know that the need to expand public employment program remains clear and obvious. But we also know that there are, let's say, fiscal constraints, and those fiscal constraints actually is a key barrier to expand the public employment programs. So in this context, and from your perspective, what more can be done to demonstrate the economic and social value of these programs in order to mobilize, let's say, alternative source of funding, and how, for instance, to let's say, to strengthen the commitment of the financial systems or philanthropic actors? Thank you.
Yes, and I think important to just highlight, particularly maybe for an international audience also, is we've really seen the importance of reimagining public employment programs as an instrument. I mean, we have seen around the world public works programs, as they're often called, can be pretty awful. And we need to recognize that. There have been many contexts in the world where such programs have been used as a kind of proxy for other forms of social assistance. And when that's the case, often the working conditions are poor, the social value created is relatively weak, people are paid stipends rather than wages. But I think it's very important to understand that these are policy choices, and you can choose to design public employment programs differently. And that is exactly what we have tried to do, which is to ensure that these programs the work is seen as quality work to the extent that they become aspirational, and that the social value that is created is recognized at community level and in the society as a whole. And I think, to give an example, right now we have 200,000 young people in post as assistants in schools. That program, for the 200,000 positions that were advertised, 1.9 million young people applied for those posts in a 3-week window. And we see that as actually reflecting the extent to which young people actually see those jobs as jobs they want to do, rather than what has been the case before, that actually young people have often not wanted to participate in such programs. And I think it's to give another example, our Social Employment Fund works with civil society organizations to do work at community level that serves the common good, and that work is identified at community level. So it's a slightly atypical form of public employment program because the implementing partners are all civil society actors. That program has 50,000 people in employment right now, and it's doing everything from food security support, early childhood development, combating gender-based violence, catchment management, you name it. If the work serves the common good and there's agency and energy behind it at the local level, it can qualify for support from the program. And in that process, we've put a lot of energy into measuring the social value of the work. And a recent study is giving us a 20 times multiplier in terms of the social and economic value that is being created through this work. And we're increasingly using that kind of evaluation and assessment to mobilize additional resources. To get to the nub of your question, which is how do we demonstrate the social value that's created in order to mobilize different kinds of resources. So the schools program that I've just referenced this time around was not actually funded by the Fiscus. It was funded by our UIF Reserve Fund, which is the contributors to that are workers and employers, and they agreed to that use of that reserve fund money. In the Social Employment Fund, all of the implementing partners have to raise complementary funding from other sources. I think an interesting thing that is also happening is we're putting a lot of emphasis on the interface between these programs and livelihood and self-employment opportunities. There just are no jobs in our economy at the moment. 10% of unemployed people, only 10% of people actively looking for work are absorbed into our labor market each year. That leaves 90% who are not being absorbed. Hard as self-employment and the entrepreneurial track are, we have to find ways to support people to optimize those opportunities. So we're now looking at co-funding mechanisms that would bring in asset financing, asset grants, support to those kinds of pathways as complementary forms of financing. And finally, the transformation fund that is being set up by our Department of Trade and Industry, we are looking at embedding support for these kinds of programs as part of the social contribution of that fund, which is will be financed by the private sector by a whole range of conditionalities, which I won't try and explain to a foreign audience here. But I think the point is that we are finding ways to leverage resources to support forms of employment where market-based, where the private sector can't absorb people at the scale of social need. We're finding ways to mobilize complementary resources for work that serves the common good.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think that we really understood how relevant are the public employment program, and particularly given the fact that, and you highlighted nicely, that the labor market is not able to absorb all the labor force each year, and there is also a need to push for, let's say, entrepreneurship, MSME creation. And maybe let me turn to you, Tracy. So you've mentioned earlier that the urgent need to expand, universal access to electricity, and moving from survival access to developmental access to basic services remain key. And I would like to know what is your recommendation to move forward that better developmental access, and what is the link to also to strengthen, let's say, the MSME creation? Because your first answer, you've highlighted quite nicely the fact that according to your empirical work, there is a strong correlation, between access to electricity and food security. But what does it mean also for MSME creation? Thank you.
So I think that there are two things here. I mean, there are a lot of technical debates that we've been involved in about how do you improve the implementation of the free basic services and expand the indigent register. But I think there's a bigger, more important argument. And that is how you conceptualize access to electricity in a high poverty, high inequality society like South Africa, and our insistence on essentially commodifying access to electricity, I think is at the heart of many of the problems. People keep saying to me, people have to pay for something. They have to pay for something because people get benefits for it. The free basic electricity and subsidized electricity is seen as some kind of grudge allocation, some kind of charity that you really don't want to give to poor people. And I think we have to reconceptualize how we imagine that, especially if renewables hold the promise of vast amounts of electricity. We need to start thinking about access to electricity much more like we think about access to education, where we understand that the benefits accrue to the individual, but that there are huge social benefits to having higher levels of education and having people have access to more education, that everybody benefits from it. And I think we need to start in this new kind of energy future, we need to start thinking about electricity in that way, that it isn't something that you can only access if you can pay for it, but that there's a broader social benefit that accrues to it. And I think that thinking needs to be applied as well to the broader climate transition. So if we understand that climate change is going to make access to a lot of resources much more uncertain and much more limited, basic resources like water and land. When we think about climate adaptation and the climate transition, have we really thought about the basis on which people are going to have access to those resources in the future? And this idea of some kind of commons of resources, rather than having this thinking that people can only access things if they pay for it, because that is not an effective long-term strategy to create higher levels of economic growth and development and higher levels of equity, which is exactly what the just transition is supposed to be delivering.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. equitability because it's also a very good way to support SMME creation, for instance. Maybe let's open the floor for maybe questions. Maybe you can take 2 or 3 questions, but as mentioned by Alex, we're going to have a dedicated session at the end of this session for broader discussion. Is there a burning question? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I'm from the local community, but I just want to know from our panelists, do the local community own these discussions? How are they involved? Or is it a discussion in the university, government, and then we will impose it on the local people? Anything that is not owned is not sustainable. You can go back to the BEE laws. Look what it brought to the community. Because the people who should have been empowered in the local community were not empowered. But those who were in the upper level, they got all the money. And this is where we are. And I think when I listen, I'm not involved in all these big institutions. I see the same thing. As long as those who are upper understand, those who have nothing, they will have to cope. And we don't have a future. But I want to find from you, how is this discussion processes owned from the local community? Are you sure it's owned by the people underneath?
Thank you so much for your comments and question. Yeah, there is another here question at the front.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Viwe Sopodula. I'm from the National Treasury. I just have one question that I'd like the panel to engage us on. So how do we normalize or regulate the language for ordinary people to actually understand how energy affects a normal person on the ground? Because when you think about the ideas around energy, it's usually high level language that is not reachable to a normal person. And I like the example that one of the panelists gave in terms of talking about the access to education in terms of cooking and making it practical as possible. So how do we relax the language just to make sure that people on the ground actually understand? And I guess as a follow-up or link to that question is to say also, how do we then make energy and electricity a basic human right dynamic? Because linked to all of that is human rights and dignity and all of those things that are linked to actually the right to access energy and energy and electricity. How do we? Because I think that message is actually very much stronger to say that these are basic human right dynamics and in things that people are entitled to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe last question, please. Yeah.
Morning, everyone. So I'm Sihle from Rapid Concessions. I'm actually glad that someone from National Treasury just came up because the question I was about to ask is around coordination, for example, the PCC and National Treasury. We just had the MTBPS published. And it seems like from a national treasury perspective, we're moving towards austerity measures, fiscal consolidation, whereas we're in a transition that actually requires an expansionary fiscal policy so that we're able to actually create the jobs that were mentioned by the panelists. So I'm just interested to know whether, to what extent is there coordination between all these decision makers in the government and also the PCC and other relevant stakeholders. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So maybe let's move on to the first one on community involvement. Who would like to take? Yeah.
I'm happy to start on that one. And firstly, to fully agree with the speaker. If we fail to get ownership of the process at the local level, we will have failed. That's partly, what the talk of equity and whole of society approaches and so on is about. And I think we can all accept that while there are efforts in this regard, they are not sufficient at this point. But I'd like to just use an example from the public employment space. So, if we're talking about local ownership, it has to be local. And so it's not necessarily, every locality is not represented in a forum such as this. But to give the example of Kamati, where there were failures of support to local economic development when that power station closed, and research showed that there had been insufficient participation and insufficient support. And in that context, it was agreed that the Social Employment Fund would initiate a local program focused on things like food security, early childhood development, and so on. And that process was driven through local consultation. There is a local steering committee with local constituencies on it. The program has gone sufficiently well that the community is pushing hard for it to be extended in a context of fiscal constraints. But I think the point is well taken, but I think there are actually some emergent examples of how these processes are being operationalized in practice, and it's useful to surface those. Thanks.
So I think just to echo, it is very important to have local ownership. So as a university-affiliated research institute, we see our role is to try and influence policy to reflect the issues that are most important for communities. Most of our research work is extensive work in communities. So the work that we've been doing around access to electricity, the challenges that households face in accessing electricity, the real impact on people's lives is based on now almost 4 years of work in communities around South Africa. And our goal in that research is to, as far as we possibly can, show what policy priorities should be in these communities. So communities are very involved in co-producing research with us. We make a strong point of going back into the communities that have worked with us to share the research with them and to talk through these issues. So very, very much in our research, it is about trying to raise the things that are most important to communities. And around the just transition in Mpumalanga, we spent about a year in communities around Mpumalanga trying to understand exactly where the frustration with the processes lay and what needed to change in the so-called consultation process in order to give effect to what were the real priorities of communities and why they were not being captured in the process.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Would like to add Lebrang, or maybe let's, yeah.
Yeah, when the Presidential Climate Commission it does its recommendations, we often do look to include the views of local communities, and there's a complexity that is at play there. What do you consider to be sufficient consensus? How deep do you go in terms of public consultation and participation? So I think there's generally issues related to how public participation does unfold, and I'll admit that. I mean, the methodology that we followed over the years sometimes is not fit for purpose for every public consultation that you have with communities, and there's definitely a great need for some sort of adaptability. So I agree 100% that there definitely is a need for better ways to involve public participation and rethink methodologies when it comes to public consultation.
Thank you, Lebrun. Let's take the second and third question all together. So the second one was related to how to increase the right to access to electricity, whilst the third one was related to how to strengthen the coordination with decision makers. Maybe Tracy, if you can start.
So yeah, so we've had an ongoing conversation with National Treasury over the last couple of years about increasing the free basic electricity. And the response is that while they understand a need for it, there isn't the fiscal space to do that. I think our main counter argument there, and I think it would speak tangentially to the issue of austerity, is, you know, I think our position would be that when the fiscal is in a fiscally constrained position, it's not about cutting expenditure on everything. It's about understanding what kind of expenditure is going to have the biggest benefit on equity and pro-poor development. So we've been doing some work now around trying to understand the cost-benefit analysis of, if we spend an extra 8 billion rand a year on free basic services, what are the economic benefits that we could get from that in terms of reduced child malnutrition, improved household food security, and then also thinking about how we can focus those resources on the poorest households. When you focus the free basic services on the giving more free services to the poorest households, you have a very strong pro-equity benefit. So I think for us, the issue is about how do we work within this idea of fiscal constraints to have a more equitable impact by focusing more on the most vulnerable households. But it is an ongoing argument. So if you're from National Treasury, go tell Jan Hatting that we need 200 kilowatt hours of free electricity every month. Hello, Jan.
Okay, so I think we should stop. So yeah, but I'm sure we're gonna have, you know, a better commitment and discussion on the last discussion. So I would like to thank Tracy, Lebrun, and Kate, you know, for your time, for, you know, the very stimulating discussion we've had. Thanks a lot, and yeah, so let's keep the momentum. Yeah.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adrian Joseph. I am a research fellow in the Climate Change and Natural Resources program at SAIIA, and I'll be your moderator for the second panel. I think we've had a very engaging first panel, and we hope to keep that momentum into the second panel. What I'd say is that in the second panel, we'll just continue from this panel into an open Q&A to foster greater engagement and so on. And I also just want to mention that we have 70 people online that are also attending this dialogue, so welcome to those. So if I could please just welcome my panelists to the front. I see Alex Benkenstein is already here. Can I welcome Yashila Govender and Simpiwe Mabela as well to the front? Can we give them a round of applause as they come forward? Oh, there he is. They both snuck up behind me. I think Alex gave a very excellent introduction. He explained the context of this meeting, the fact that this side event is taking place on the sidelines of the G20 Social Summit, and many of the agendas and things discussed here are obviously related to agendas discussed there. Okay. So just a brief introduction for the panelists. Yashila Govender is a technical officer working in the Greenworks program at the Sariti Institute. She holds an MSc in environmental science and has a strong academic and professional background in sustainability, environmental science, and project implementation. Her work focuses on the technical aspects of community and sustainable development with a commitment to supporting climate action and regenerative agriculture. Welcome. Alex Benkenstein's most important qualification is that he's my boss, but he's also the program head of the Climate and Natural Resources Program at SAIIA. His work centers on sustainability, climate change, oceans governance, the blue economy, and the governance of extractive industries and fisheries in Africa. And then last but not least, Simpiwe Mabela is a technical specialist in health, HIV/AIDS at the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Team for Eastern and Southern Africa. He specializes in the management of development projects with a strong focus on labor standards, occupational health, and safety and employment equity in workplaces. So welcome to my panelists. Alex, if I might start with you, could you tell us a little bit more perhaps about, there was some mention made about to what extent is there local ownership in this process? Can you tell us a bit about the G20 process and its work around the just energy transition? What has SAIIA's involvement been and what work has the G20 done around the just energy transition?
Is this one up? Okay, perfect. So I did want to, we had that comment from Lebogang on reflecting, you know, what was the real value? And I think, you know, the summit is still coming, and I'm sure there's going to be some fireworks around the summit. We already know a number of heads of state are not going to be attending, and all the tensions around the US position in terms of South Africa's presidency. So this is the broader context. I think it must be said that this is certainly one of the most difficult years in recent years to achieve anything in the multilateral forum. Now, you asked specifically about the work on the just transition. There are actually elements of work on the energy transition that took place across multiple working groups. For those in the audience maybe not familiar with the G20 structure, I won't be able to lay it all out, but there is a very good website, official South African G20 website, and what you'll see there is that the work of the G20 is divided into a finance track and a Sherpa track, and each of those two tracks has multiple working groups that deal with various issues, and then G20 presidencies also have the ability to establish specific task forces to conduct work over a one-year period in which they hold the presidency. So, very quickly, there was obviously the core of the work sits within the Energy Transitions Working Group, but there was also elements of this work sitting in the Sustainable Finance Working Group and in the Climate and Environment Sustainability Working Group. The Climate and Environment Sustainability Working Group actually came out with a really interesting report dealing with this topic of looking at the just transition, but also reflecting on the just transition beyond a narrow focus on the energy sector. So I don't want to go into too much details in my response. What I do want to say is that when we look at the work of the G20, I think it's important to reflect that it's not just about whether or not we got a ministerial statement or whether a particular phrasing found its way into the leaders' declaration. I like to say that the G20 is a process, it's not an event. And your question was also about SAIIA's engagement. Obviously, we have that formal T20 role, but we also work directly with DIRCO and work directly with various government departments leading some of these working groups. And we could see in those negotiations how countries communicated their positions, how they worked towards consensus, even when they couldn't achieve consensus. It, I think, revealed negotiating positions, which is itself very useful for other forums. It helped to introduce certain core ideas. I think the emphasis that South Africa placed on sustainability, solidarity, equality, that message really did come across. And speaking again to that technical report, there were a whole range of technical reports produced through these working groups, which brought together technical experts, which engaged directly with government officials, and through which kind of certain coalitions can work to take this work forward. So I haven't gone much into SAIIA's work, but I don't want to do too much self-promotion. Maybe I would say just very briefly that there are some great resources also on the SAIIA website that lays out exactly the role that SAIIA has played and has links to various publications that SAIIA has produced throughout this process.
Thanks so much, Alex. I would also just echo your sentiments to say that while, of course, we have certain outcomes that we'd like to achieve as part of the G20 presidency, of course, there are plenty, even if we don't achieve that as a first prize, there are, of course, lots of excellent processes and outputs that have been produced whose value is not tied to achieving a specific outcome within a specific working group or so on. So I would just echo that sentiment. But going from the lofty heights of the G20 to local communities, Yashila, if I can turn to you, SAIIA has been doing a lot of important work in communities related to the just energy transition. Do you want to perhaps tell us a little bit more about your work and what you've learned through it?
Great, thank you. I just want to say that, when we talk about this just energy transition, I think everyone in the room kind of knows the terminology, what it means, the broader context in terms of climate change, this reason for us to kind of transition away from what we know. But when we go down to local community or grassroots level, we see that's not necessarily the same. This coal is a livelihood. It's a means of, kind of paying the bills, paying school fees, and maintaining this dignity within our communities. And there's these different types of documents that come along with the just energy transition. We have the just energy framework, we have the just energy implementation plan, we have the just energy investment plan, all these different types of frameworks. But when we go down to grassroots level, there's no one really kind of taking this message and kind of explaining to the community what this really means. So what we see at SAIIA is that, this is a really big problem, and that's where we come in as an implementation partner. So we had our previous panel speaking about Komati as an example. So we have different public employment programs. So one of them is the Social Employment Fund, and that's primarily working in Komati. So here we see that we've taken 300 individuals and we've trained them in different thematic areas. And, an issue before we went into this community, we saw that there's a lot of short-term opportunities, especially after the closure of the mine. However, now, there's not a lot of focus on these long-term opportunities. And through the SEF Komati program, we've now provided different avenues or opportunities where people are a little bit more aware of, the opportunities outside of coal per se. So we've trained them in different thematic areas as touched on previously as well. And these thematics fall under food security, greening in the environment, and ECD centers, sport, and so forth. And that's kind of like what we've been doing. But what we see is that I'm using an example of some of the work we've done previously. With our partners for Breed Cities and C40, we've been capacitating people, and we do this through local CBOs. So these CBOs understand this local community level dynamics and are able to go in and capacitate them according to local context. So for one of these projects that we're working on, we're looking at air pollution and air quality and how it relates to climate change. And through this, people are able to speak about their different local contexts and contextualize it and kind of create this awareness and take this ownership within their community. So, yeah.
Great, it's wonderful to hear. I think one of the core themes has been, in our discussions, has been about the importance of the social acceptance of the energy transition. And that won't happen, that won't take place unless the energy transition is not also a vehicle to generate employment and to deal with many of the historical inequalities brought about by the kinds of energy system that we've inherited in South Africa. Sticking on the issue of labor and the importance of decent work, I now want to turn to Simpiwe. Simpiwe, can you tell us a little bit about the International Labour Organization, your work, and what are some of the things that you're doing to ensure that the concerns of labor are well represented and to ensure that workers' rights are upheld in the just energy transition?
Yeah, thank you very much, Adrian, and good morning, everyone. I think it's only fair maybe to start by defining who the ILO is, because from time to time we get a question, Simpiwe, what does the ILO do? And don't tell us a story, just in one line. So if I were to use that approach in terms of defining the work of the ILO is an international labor standard setting organization, full stop. And to date, there's about 408 instruments that are divided into 3. 192 conventions, 6 protocols, and 208 recommendations. So those are the standards that I'm talking about. Now, reality is there's no single standard, be it a convention, recommendation, or a protocol that is exclusively focusing on just transition. However, there's a number of conventions that actually are very much relevant to just transition. So I just want to maybe quickly reflect first on the other instruments that are there, like guidelines that we would publish or code of practices. So we have anchored our work on just transition within a guideline that we published in 2015. And this is the just transition. And if you were to summarize that guideline, one, it focuses on respecting fundamental principles and rights at work. And I think many of us, if not all of us in the room, if we were to define decent work and its pillars, one pillar focuses on rights at work. And we have conventions that would support that. But also, the guideline on just transition focuses on effective social dialogue. And what this means is we have to make sure that the process is inclusive. And I was here when a colleague was asking about ownership. And the world of work, as much as it's operating in a normative space, but it's a very defined community. So if you talk about ownership within the world of work, the very first group that has to own that work, it's workers and their representatives. And I think Lebo would agree with me because she also comes from that space. But you also have employers within the ILO, and you have government. So that's how social dialogue would function. And this actually would ensure that the design and implementation of work related to just transition is embracing that kind of approach. Then the other part, Adrian, has to do with decent work creation, because there has to be creation of decent work, ensuring that climate and technology transitions, they lead to quality jobs rather than losses, because sometimes it's not perception that people will lose jobs because of these transitions. It's a reality. So if we don't ensure decent work, then that's a problem. The second last point, Adrian, that I want to mention is around social protection. And this is also part of decent work. Because for workers and communities that are affected by structural changes, there has to be protection that is there. Then finally, we also have to look at it through a lens of gender equality and inclusion. Because addressing vulnerabilities of young people, young women, for instance, or women or marginalized groups, so it's going to be very important. So there is that intersectional approach that the ILO is facilitating, and we are doing this through the international labor standards. I'll stop here.
Great, thank you so much, Mpiwe. I think it's important, and it's been touched on a couple of times now, that the importance of procedural justice in the just energy transition, that if we don't have a just process, we're unlikely to get a just outcome. But in the interest of opening up, just one more question for each of my panelists. From your lips to the ears of G20 leaders, what are some of the things, given on what we've spoken about in the previous panel, some of the discussion we've had in this panel, what are some key recommendations that you would put forward to emphasize this whole of society approach to a just energy transition for G20 leaders? Alex, I think I'll start with you.
There have been some principles, even last year under the Brazilian presidency in the G20, that speak to some of these issues. And so we've seen the debate develop in the G20. So I think really what it comes down to is using the political weight of the G20 to take those concrete steps beyond high-level principles and really get into the practicalities of how these processes can be implemented. That can be lesson sharing, that can be very specific, concrete work about financing. I think we do need to recognize that there are innovations happening across G20 countries, certainly in South Africa, that this community of countries can learn from and can also support the broader, shall we say, global South. I mean, you know, we're sitting here in Africa, and this just transition discussion is so pressing across the continent and in other developing regions. So it's really to we've actually done good work on high-level principles. What we need now is practical implementation and thinking concretely through what an institution and a process like the G20 can do to facilitate that.
Thanks, Alex. In one word, implementation. Sheila, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to preface my answer by kind of going into a study we did last year. So Seriti Institute did a study last year where we looked at the coal mining belt, and we interviewed 10,000 people that work directly in the coal sector. So I just want to kind of bring some of these key findings out. So we saw that 36% of this 10,000 do not know what a just energy transition is. And 54% of that 10,000 understand or have heard of the term climate change before, which is very alerting. And obviously when we have to scale this to a South African perspective, it shows that there's a need for capacity building and understanding this why. So I would say that based on what we've been seeing on the ground, it's probably, you know, we would have to look at capacitating our communities, but also in terms of what kind of media would suit them. So something like, you know, maybe a podcast may not necessarily work in different communities because, you know, in access to the internet is still kind of limited. So kind of the importance of the source of material we are using. And I think there was a question a little bit earlier about how we are breaking down the terms and how we are explaining to people. So that's when those local CBOs kind of come into place, and when we have to think of you know, kind of giving the agency to these CBOs to capacitate our community. And only through that can we see that the just energy transition is something that is tangible and can be understood.
Yes, very much agreed. I think given that there are many institutions that self-style themselves as knowledge brokers in this room, I think there is an open question about how best do we package all this research and evidence that we put together in a way that actually makes sense to local communities who have knowledge of their own naturally, even if it's not always put in polished reports or so on. Spiro, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. one of the terms that are used in describing the ILO is tripartite. And the ILO is the only tripartite agency of the UN. But now, when you are in South Africa, one has to apply caution when you use the term tripartite, because tripartite has another connotation in South Africa, meaning that it's the ruling party, it's COSATU and the SACP. But tripartite in the ILO, it's government, employers, and the trade unions. So I want to start from there. And within that space of tripartism in the ILO, it was actually the labor movement that was part of coining the term just transition. But my feeling is, and our observation is, that the just part of just transition is actually forgotten. And that for me is a challenge, because if we don't acknowledge the justice aspects of just transition, then we're going to be missing the part. Because part of it, we know that women and men are actually are not affected the same way by the transition processes. So for me, Adrian, the recommendation really lies on us being inclusive, using the intersectionality lens, so that we are able to customize the initiatives according to the needs of the people that are affected, because they are not affected differently. And I think coming together and complement the work that we are doing is going to be one of the best ways, because whilst we are working within the normative space, there are other groups that are part of, advocating for the work, but we should give each other space and make sure that we complement each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simpiwe. Before I ask you to give the panelists a round of applause, we're going to go into an open Q&A now, but I want to stress that the Q&A session is open to the panelists currently in front of you, but of course also the first panel. And given the fact that we have plenty of representation from different expert organizations in the room, if there's a question that's asked and you feel you would like to jump in, you needn't sit here to answer a question, right? So, so can I ask you to give a round of applause? Thank you very much to our panelists. Okay, I think we'll do a round of 3 questions first. We have one here, Kirsten.
Oh, so thanks. I think my question is to the colleague from SAIIA. So last year, due to the challenges with Transnet and just a number of other challenges related to the volatility in the coal price, SAIIA laid off 1,000 workers, I think, in that range. And on the other side, there seemed to be a number of developments in the SAIIA Green side of things in terms of business models. I'm just having seen that experience and also seeing what's happening in Komati, and I think it's going to be just a broader experience in the coal sector. When things like this happen, is this not an opportunity for us to institutionalize justice and just transition practices at an industrial level, at the level of the mines and the mining sector, I think more practically, as opposed to leaving workers to really be like casualties of the transition?
If there's not an additional question for now, then I'll allow you to answer that one.
Maybe let me just preface by saying that I'm from SAIIA Institute, not SAIIA Green or SAIIA Mining. But yes, no, of course. And I mean, from the way we deal with things, we look at that capacity. We do hold these stakeholder engagements where we understand, like especially in Komati, for instance, and how the closure of that mine has affected that community. So 100% agree with you. But I still want to just kind of drive the point of capacitation in terms of that local level. and the importance of it for communities to take that ownership of that. So yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah, can I jump in? Yeah. So Lebo, on a lighter note, you know, actually, when Kirsten will tell you that when I saw Seriti, I immediately thought it was Seriti Resources, the mining company. Uh, but the point I want to make, and I'm kind of throwing it back to you, Lebo, this comment, because we know that the mining industry, as much as it is aligned with the ILO conventions, but because it's a separate industry, and I'm going to make an example from an occupational health and safety point of view. And there are two conventions. There's a broad convention, Convention 155, which covers all industries. However, there's Convention 176, which is on mining, mine health and safety. And there's a tendency with mining to only select that particular convention, and they forget that there's a number of other conventions that they have to comply with. Because if they were to ensure that they also use Convention 144, they use Convention 122 on employment, then it becomes easier for them to appreciate and recognize that they will reduce creating situations that will make workers to be vulnerable. So I think the labor movement, whilst I know that you may have affiliates that work there, but I think as a federation, your guidance and interventions would kind of assist in limiting these kind of consequences. Yeah.
If there's, let me just take one question from online, then I'll take from the floor again. Question from online from James Lee. Thank you for the question. Is what is young people's role in the just energy transition, and how has or how will youth engagement help and influence the G20 process? I think there is youth at SAIIA representation, yeah. So would they like to field that question?
Yeah, my name is Donovan Fuller, and I'm from the Youth at SAIIA program. So yeah, so there's various ways that young people can get involved and be engaged. I can speak from our program's perspective in particular. We have various programs where we go around the country. We've had road shows around the country, particularly related to the G20, where we kind of created awareness and around the G20 processes, the structural functioning thereof, but also how youth can get involved in these different projects and that we offer as a capacity building and empowering program within the SAIIA context. So yeah, so from our perspective, there's definitely opportunities, many opportunities for young people to get involved. We have what we called, as part of our capacity building program as well, we have what we call the South African Youth Action Plan, Climate Action Plan that was developed by youth, as youth-led. And we've taken that, for example, to on a roadshow to communities, to rural communities, talking about the issues around just transition and climate impacts and so on rural communities, but also getting the sense from young people in those communities, what are the experiences and how climate change is impacting on their lives and livelihoods and so on. We also have training programs around climate negotiations. We have what we call a model or negotiation simulation. We, for example, also had a series of model COP30s around the country with young people, high schoolers and university students. And this is part of a broader capacity building and an awareness campaign that we've taken around the country. So from our side, that is a tangible way of getting young people involved in these discussions and taking it to communities. And we urge people and young people in particular, to get involved. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Donovan. That was fantastic. There's maybe a more general element that I just want to highlight on that question, and that is that, especially in our first panel, there was the discussion about entrepreneurialism, innovation. I think there's some very challenging realities we face often when we think about the just transition and jobs lost in the energy sector. You know, our mind immediately goes to green tech sectors. A job lost in the coal sector might be in solar or might be in e-vehicles. I do feel that we need a broader lens. We need to look across our economy at where opportunities are. We've heard those opportunities are scarce. We know that youth often don't have access to finance and there's severe limitations they face. But we also know that there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of innovation coming from young people. I'm thinking through to the Climate Innovation Hub that was hosted at the Second African Climate Summit, where young climate innovators from across the continent were brought together to show their ideas and to link with funders. So there is the question in terms of engagement in just transition that speaks to shaping how we think and how these different programs are formed and the phrasing and the different processes, policy processes, but there's also the very practical element of bringing those ideas and linking up with some of those institutions that are out there to support young entrepreneurs and to provide them with the structure and guidance and even finance to make their ideas a reality.
Thanks, Alex. There was a question in the room. Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm just taking the mic again because no one at that point wanted to say something. I'm just gonna add a comment. I think this is just a comment before I get to my question. I think there is honestly a problem around thinking and how we think about issues of this nature. Because when it comes to energy and electricity, I mean, and climate change, we treat it as and when we deal with the problem. If, for example, the lights would go off now, we would know it's load shedding and we're saying, now, okay, what is the problem? Similar to issues around climate change, if you experience, whatever natural disaster, that is the time that you actually think about the practical impact of climate change. So I think that is partly the problem that we have around the thinking around these issues. But my question really is, I mean, I've got an appreciation for the inclusion of the gender element in this discussion, because I think it is something that is often forgotten to say the impact from a gender lens perspective. And I think in my area of work, which is a question that I'm posing, is to say, there is a big issue around the data segregation when it comes to looking at issues around, general government or societal issues. I just wanted to get the panelists' take on what are the dynamics around data segregation and how data actually impacts and the availability of data and our ability and tools that we have to actually get data to inform either solutions or decisions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Simpiwe, do you want to take that question on the lack of gender disaggregated data related to the just energy transition?
Yeah, so as much as I don't have much, but I think the notes that I prepared, Adrian, I had included an area to focus on monitoring and accountability. I think there's a wonderful term that is now used in the development space in terms of data collection, analysis, and reporting, which is strategic information. And that broader term refers to actually not only to collection, but also analysis and reporting. And if we use data-driven approaches, then we are able to track progress and just strategies. And the final point that I want to make, and once again, you will pardon me, because I come from a normative organization, so I will reply from a normative approach. I made mention of these conventions, and Adrian, I actually prepared and identified, about 7 conventions that we need to be looking at. And I'll quickly go back to the issue of monitoring and reporting. And the question that was asked earlier, reminds me of one convention in the ILO, which is Convention 168, and it's on promotion of employment and protection against unemployment. Because we know that in the process, there will be people who will be losing employment. But if we have standards that will protect people from unemployment, then it means we need to promote ratification of those standards. And I can tell you right now, ratification of 168 is very low because either people may not be aware or it may be for other reasons. But we have a mechanism in the ILO, and coming back to what the colleague is asking regarding data, we have what is called supervisory mechanisms. And one of the highest of those mechanisms is called the Committee of Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations. And what they do, they actually collect data on an annual basis, reports from various countries, all the 187 member states of the ILO. And that is very rich information because they would, member states would submit the reports to the ILO, then the committee sits down, analyzes vis-a-vis what they know is happening within the labor market space. So I think there are pockets of information that we could draw from, including these reports that the ILO would generate, particularly from the Committee of Experts in the application of conventions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simpiwe. Yes.
Sorry, Adrian. I was just wondering if maybe Tracy or Kate have a comment on that question about gender and data. Sorry to put you on the spot. If you'd rather skip, that's fine. Sorry, Kirsten. I was just prompting some of our first panelists to see if they had some insight on that.
So the data issue is actually incredibly important. So a lot of the work that we did in communities, we'd hear communities and people saying over and over again about the formal consultations around the just transition. Communities would say, yeah, it's not that we don't understand the presentation. It's not that we don't understand the plan. The issue is that the presentation and the plan have got nothing to do with our lives. And it's not just as straightforward as saying, yeah, well, the people who made the plan are ignoring people, but there's a very specific way in which planning is done based on data. So there's a very limited set of what is considered credible data, what is considered evidence for policy making. And that tends to be official data sets. And it's fundamentally official data sets around formal employment, data sets around formal economic activity. And those official data sets fail to capture many of the realities of people's lives. And I think it's not just an epistemological debate. It's not about what counts as knowledge. It's fundamentally about what counts as reality. So we have got data sets in making policy that completely ignores a vast amount of reality of people's lives. And the reality is that the poorer you are and the more female you are, the more likely you are to not exist from the point of view of policy making. And I think that is a real issue that we need to think about.
Thanks, Tracy. There's an issue of epistemic injustice there. Thank you. This will be the final question and then we'll close. Thank you.
Can I go? Oh, sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tato Mazwe Maribo. I am the co-founder and vice chairman at AMARI, African Minds of Applied Research Institute. Just before I start with my question, on that youth aspect, if I may, likewise at AMARI, we do have a sustainability and energy sector where we are trying our best to actually assemble, well, we already do have a team of young researchers who are doing work on climate change and sustainability. So we are very eager to going into 2026 and beyond to work on these type of projects where we are promoting young intelligentsia within the sector. So I just wanted to just add that. My question is, how can microfinance institutions redesign redesigned to serve as a catalyst for financing for decentralized green energy systems, particularly in last mile communities where traditional credit models fail without increasing the debit burden on vulnerable households. I apologize, I have a bit of a finance background, if that is a bit too much to add. Thank you.
Thanks. Do any of the panelists want to take the question on microfinancing? Yeah. Okay, all right.
Good morning. Thank you very much for invitation to this interesting and something that touches us directly, challenges that are directly affecting us, old and, in the local communities. Challenges that are facing communities have been, you mentioned, the cost of electricity. In terms of electricity, it's the cost, it's the availability, it's this and that and that. But there's something that is very, very serious. And I'm talking from experience. Extortion of communities, especially the poor communities, by subcontractors and officials in local municipalities. Most households are on prepaid. One, if you owe water and other things from the municipality and you are on prepaid electricity in the middle of winter and they target those very cold days, then they block your electricity, you can't buy. With that little money that you get from SASSA, because electricity, as it has been said, it's a basic need. It's no longer luxury, like in our time when we grew up. Families that had electricity were, rich families, but you need electricity. And then you've got subcontractors that are contracted to the municipality who will go around knowing that you have been blocked. Then they come and tell people to pay them. They will reconnect you. And then you are gone. The debts that you owe from the municipality, you'll never finish, because each time they come back, they will switch on the electricity and they come back again. And the minute you stop, or if you resisted paying them, they will come and remove your meter. And that is something very, very serious that is affecting communities. And on the other hand, you've got these puzzle shops that most of them don't even pay for electricity to the municipality. And they pay to individuals working into municipality. So those are some of the things that are happening and nobody speaks about them. Whilst we're looking at, financial challenges and to access electricity. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Questions of extortion and corruption as well. Do you want to?
Yeah, actually, it's quite related to the previous question, so it's good. Yeah, my question was, and actually it was, I think, a comment from Kate on the previous panel that, so yes, you do need to create jobs and provide alternatives when there are job losses. And then Kate mentioned, and sometimes, well, if you do not have enough, budget resources, you need to find complementary resources. So obviously the question is, what are these resources? Because of course, if you speak about just transitions, big question is social justice and who is paying for what? And how do you find the resources to finance these stimulus and employment package? So it's both a question in terms of domestically, I don't know here what is the social acceptance in terms of, I don't know, raising taxes or diminishing some other expenditure. And the question of corruption is also, I guess, relevant here because I remember we organized a conference a few months ago in April, and I was there with UCT. And I remember I was struck during one of the debates that the panelists had very different view about what should be the role of government and how big government should be. But the one thing they agreed upon was we cannot raise taxes until we tackle the issue of the efficiency of public spending, whether it's corruption or just the right targeting of this public expenditure. So, yeah, is it more domestic resource mobilization? Is it raising more finance from, you know, donors and IFIs? What are those alternative resources?
Thank you so much. Okay.
If I can answer that one, I mean, I think I gave some examples of alternative financing mechanisms that we are using, but I think from a wider lens, South Africa does have policies in place that recognize that all mines will come to an end, that the resources will be depleted and mines will close. And we do have policies in place that are called social labor plans, which require the mines to invest in development in local communities, and various institutional models have been set up with local community trusts and other forms. And I do think that's a model that in a sense has precedent in the sector, that also needs to be looked at in this context, so that, you know, yes, the fiscus will have to play a role. No, there's not much appetite to raise taxes, but I do think that there are other major players in the society. There's also very little appetite for further debt. But we do need to be creative. We are not a resource poor society. So it is about getting much cleverer about who pays and who benefits, yeah.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. I have to close it there. Another round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.
All right, I just want to very briefly say a thank you to our in-person audience who've joined us, also to our virtual audience. We really do appreciate the time you've taken to join with us today. I think, as you've heard, there is an enormous amount of work being done, not only by SAIIA, but from the various institutions who've spoken today. And if you have an interest in finding out more, please do reach out to us. You can, of course, visit the SAIIA website. You can also reach out directly to SAIIA on any of the emails, for example, through which you've received the invitation. We can put you in touch with any of the speakers to link you with more resources. There is, as I said, a very good G20, but there's also a strong Think20 website. Just, I always say, don't Google T20. You'll only end up with cricket results. I want to thank the AFD. You've been fantastic partners for us. And as I said at the beginning, we're really excited to see this partnership develop. And I really want to thank the SAIIA team who've supported behind the scenes. I got picked up in Cape Town by a shuttle at 4 o'clock this morning, so I wasn't in the best headspace when I arrived here, and was checking with my colleague Kirsten and Adrian about some of the basic details. The support and organization from the SAIIA team, also our comms team, our events team who've supported, has really been fantastic. You make it easy for all of us to engage in these very important discussions. So thank you to everyone here, and look forward to engaging in the future.
Thank you very much
Kirsten?
to our Zoom attendees. We appreciate
Kirsten,
you. We are
at the
closing now.
back. Could you just join us for a photo, please?
Sure, I'm here still. Please join us outside as well for coffee and for photos.